Welcome to Rising Woman Leaders. I'm your host, Meredith Ram, and I believe the time has come for women to share their gifts, their voice, and their stories. I love seeing women spiritually and financially empowered, thriving in their life's work, and doing what they love every day. I've gathered a community of women living their dreams to tell us their stories and inspire us to step into more courage, self-love, and feminine leadership. If you like this podcast, follow me on Instagram at Rising Woman Leaders and sign up for email updates at risingwomanleaders.com. Now get cozy with a journal and a cup of tea. I hope you enjoy today's show. I'm here today with Meg Berryman, who is a mother, a teacher, a healer, a podcaster, and a social scientist that empowers women to step into their sacred social leadership. It was an honor to be on Meg's podcast recently, the Beyond Being Well. Some of you out there may have heard that conversation because I also shared it on Rising Woman Leaders. We had such a great conversation. And today I get to hear more about Meg and her work and her world. So thanks for being here, Meg.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to just dive right in and ask you what sacred social leadership is. What does that mean to you?
Sacred social leadership to me is the natural next step that we find ourselves taking once we have empowered ourselves toward wholeness. So I believe it's not such a linear process. I think we're cyclical and we work in cycles. So I think our sacred social leadership comes up in various cycles and seasons that we find ourselves in. But I really believe that within all of us, we have a desire for a better tomorrow. It is innately human to feel like we want to be, do, feel, and as a community come together better. And so I really feel as though sacred social leadership is the natural evolution of us as spiritual women, as women dedicated to our holistic well-being journey. We get to a certain point where we start to feel into questions like, what's my legacy? And questions like, how can I use my gifts in order to, move us as a collective forward towards a kinder, more sustainable, more equitable world? We ask questions like, how can I be of service? And you'll find that those questions kind of only start to come up once we reach a certain feeling of our basic needs being met, right? So I feel like when we're in fight or flight, when we're in a deep survival mode, when we're the victims of systems of oppression even, it's very difficult to kind of talk about self-transcendence. So I think it's worth acknowledging that sacred social leadership can kind of It kind of comes into our experience when we feel as though we have something to say that's bigger than ourselves. And I think that comes from self-empowerment. It comes from self-knowledge. It comes from self-realization and self-actualization. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it kind of like when a lot of times we awaken to the spiritual journey because maybe something is going on something is out of alignment, maybe in our body or in our job, career path, or something that's very more focused on the self. But it sounds like as we become more whole and do that healing journey, I totally agree that there is this natural inclination of of kind of waking up and being like, there's a lot going on in the world that I want to make a difference in. How can I help? And we start asking those deeper questions.
Yeah, that's a really good way of explaining it. And I think how we meet those questions is the continual evolution of the self as well. So it's not as if the self work ends and we just focus all our energy outward. In fact, it becomes this dance between our congruent leadership journey and awakening as change makers and social leaders, which we all are, realizing that we are. And then that dance between hitting a new edge of fear or worry or anxiety or a trigger, and then, coming back to the self and working through that, clearing that, being in community with that, whatever, our specific tools are, so that we can be of greater service again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know that you really see all of us as these change makers, as influencers. I'm curious if you could just share more about that. What does that mean to you?
So I think on the most basic level, in the School for Sacred Social Leaders, I teach pathways of change. So I talk about lots of different ways that we affect change. But on the most basic level, that I think many of the women in your community would really have an embodied understanding of is that as quantum beings, as energy, as vibrating energy, we are always affecting and influencing, right? We're always causing an effect through our energy, through the vibration that we're holding. And so when people say, I don't feel like a change maker, I don't feel like a social change maker, it really speaks to the very idea that we've been disempowered from feeling like that purposefully, just as women have been disempowered from feeling like leaders. There are certain people with power that have vested interests in ensuring that we don't feel powerful as change makers. So when we have a spiritual practice and we're able to maybe feel into different states of being, when we're able to shift our energy, when we become really mistresses of our energy, we can start to see, the impact of that on the people around us. And I really feel as though the journey to change maker is as much about tapping into the evidence that's in front of us and really reprogramming the idea that we're not change makers. And that really starts with seeing how when we shift our energy, when we work on that kind of quantum level and understand the universal laws and how we can work within them to create change, to influence change, then we really see our true power as change makers. I feel very strongly that sacred social leaders, it's a form of embodied leadership. So it's not about what we say or the actions that we take, because those things are a natural flow and effect of a state of being that we're cultivating. And the 4 states of being that I teach for sacred social leaders is the quality of being grounded, the quality of being guided, the quality of being expressive, and the quality of being creative. And so I feel when we can kind of work with those 4 states, embody them, remove the blocks in the way to those qualities being expressed more fully in our lives, which actually helps us feel more present and pleasurable and purposeful as well, then sacred social leadership is the natural result of that. So really basically, Meredith, just on that quantum level, I think that we are absolutely always influencing change and causing an effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love those 4 principles. It's such a foundation for just being, alive, to have a sense of purpose or fulfillment. And I think what you were speaking to, just working with those natural laws of the universe, that is what the universe wants of us, to be in that grounded, guided, expressive, creative state.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the other myths of social change is that, because I was an aid worker for 10 years, right? So I was trying to cause an effect in an outward way. And I hadn't yet had the spiritual breakdown in order to embody the inner work, to really cultivate an inner sense of awareness and all of the mastery that I feel like I have now and on a continual journey of. I was trying to cause this effect outside myself without being congruent. And if you think about the model of social change that we've been taught, which is either adversarial, so it's working towards like stopping or ending things or hating things, or it's like this very polar energy of seeing something we want to change and fighting it. Or we look at the charity model, which is about really placing ourselves as the saviors and seeing other people as victims. Both of those models I've tried and they don't work. They don't empower people. They're not moving us forward. They're actually keeping us burnt out. They're keeping us as martyrs. They're keeping us in all of these archetypal energies that as women we're trying to not be. We're trying to move forward as a collective to not be within those energies. We're trying to rewrite a different energy, of a woman leader. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important to take the time to feel into like how we believe social change happens. What are some of the kind of stories that we've just unconsciously internalized about us needing to fix or save others, and how does that play out on our internal level? And also just acknowledging that the more we empower ourselves and the more we really take the time to do that inner work and to lean into those parts of us that are unexpressed, like the creative and the pleasure huntress, and these parts that as women we've been separated from, that is social change, because that is being part of a movement of women, the rising of the feminine, however you want to call it, that is going to have long-term intergenerational effects for our kids and our kids' kids. And so it's not this either-or scenario that I have to give to the world at the expense of myself. Like, that paradigm is done. And as sacred social leaders in the school, we're trying to write a new paradigm of I can be a change maker and fully embodied and experiencing pleasure. And in fact, that's the very essence of it. Because the more I can meet my own voids and give myself my own medicine, the more that medicine is going to start to have an effect outside of us as well, through our energy, through our relationships, through the ideas that we share, and then finally through the action that we take and the words that we speak.
Thank you for that. I'm curious just about a little more of your own personal story. You mentioned that you were an aide. I'm curious, like what your career was, what you were working in, what you learned on that journey.
So for the longest time, even as a really little girl, I was fascinated with, I just had something, sometimes something else like cuts through what you were going to say, drops in. So yeah. I'm just taking a pause. Yeah, I was fascinated with anthropology and humans and why humans did things. And I think back to being a young girl and being fascinated with nature and animals and humans and evolution and all of those things. And I think what I was really seeking was evidence that we do try and do better, that socially, Bruce Lipton talks about it a lot, that we're acting as cells in a whole. So as individuals, we're actually all trying to move the species forward, and that we're all playing this like tiny little unique role in that, and that we're all subconsciously and collectively working together in order to move the species forward and ensure its survival. And I kind of think as a little detective that I was trying to find evidence for that, because I also really felt a strong sense of social justice. So my parents were both teachers. We were homeschooled until year 7, which is 12 years old. And, we're encouraged to critically think from a really young age, to look at the newspaper and look beyond the headlines and actually feel into power dynamics and what was really going on, what was really at play. But I didn't grow up with a strong spiritual practice. And so I think I started to mistake validation in my career for love. And I didn't have a strong sense of esteem or self with which to fall back on when the job necessarily wasn't going well. And so I poured all of my energy into building a career in, international aid. From a very young age, I was volunteering. I was, working 3 jobs. I was in the student activist community. I was always doing a lot because I had an enormous creative force, which I didn't know how to handle. And I know whether you relate to that, like learning your creative process being the biggest gift and journey in and of itself. So a lot of energy was going out, and I ended up working with government and UN and traveling all around the world, living and working in the Middle East and Africa and Asia. And I ended up 27, so Saturn return, and in Burma, in Myanmar, and working for a big international NGO, and having a husband, and seemingly everything in my life was perfect, right? And how many times you hear it sounds so cliche, except that it wasn't, because something internally was starting to gnaw, and it was gnawing at me in the form of physical symptoms. And so the more I was giving energy to those physical symptoms, the more I was probably creating dis-ease and getting anxious about the dis-ease, because really at that point, anything that got in the way of me receiving validation through my busyness and through my career, I was not interested in. Like anything that was going to slow me down, I would avoid and bypass and just numb out, like, because I didn't want to hear it, because I couldn't stop, because it was like this life force that was feeding me, feeding my ego, feeding my esteem. And my body just said no. And I remember it was about a month after I'd just run a half marathon in 35-degree humidity, and was working late nights and partying all weekend to deal with the stress, working on a very high profile emergency. And my body just was saying no. And at the same time, my body was saying no through fatigue and anxiety and aches and pains. There was these little glimmers of something else emerging, like something else, this entrepreneurial part of me was emerging, and I could feel the tension. So it took me 4 months, many trips back to Australia, to get a diagnosis, which was an autoimmune condition. And I had laparoscopy surgery to remove cysts on my ovaries. It was just a total, really difficult period in my life. And I had to just stop and turn around and start to face some of the questions around why I felt the need to operate at that level constantly and what the cost of that was going to be. So it started very much on the physical plane of, working with my diet and movement. And then after that, after a time, you start to realize, well, I'm still not feeling better. And so then it was the mental realm and learning to meditate. And around then I trained as a yoga teacher as well. I'd always had a yoga practice. And so it was this process of gradually questioning why as a woman I felt the need to receive this validation and what the cost of that was, and really how I wanted my life to be and look and feel, that was actually quite different from the life that I was in. And over time, that was 7 years ago now. So over time, I first moved into doing social enterprise. So I started a social enterprise cooking school in Burma. And then when we came back to Australia, I started my wellness business, really doing wellness coaching. And from there, now I'm finally bringing together those two parts of myself that for so long felt unable to coexist, which is the social justice and the spirituality. And that's where I find myself today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What are the causes that you feel most passionate about right now?
It's a good question, because as an empath, as a leader, it's easy to feel responsible for everything. And I feel like that's part of the paralysis that's going on right now. Part of the anxiety that's going on is that individuals are feeling responsible for the collective 7 billion of us. Yeah. And if you frame it like that, it feels ridiculous, and yet we feel it. So part of what I'm really working with right now is focusing so deeply on meeting my own needs to the point where that overflow of my gifts and my energy is really deep, and really planting like deep roots about one thing. Because what we need is for all of us to feel empowered enough that what we have to say, and what I have to say, is that we're all change makers, and everyone has something that we want to say, and all of those threads are going to come together like those cells. But we need to stay in our lane, and we need to really focus. And to do that, I've had to work through a lot of stuff this year, a lot of stories about being multi-passionate and wanting to be all the things, and the alchemist, and changing my energy, and actually just call BS on a lot of it because it's actually been a bypassing tool for me of actually building influence and leadership around one thing, and knowing that the form of that thing can change. So it could be through podcast or retreats or coaching or my relationships or my parenting, because sacred social leadership is not just our work, it's our whole lives. We can actually have a vision for our whole lives, and actually just trying to not contain the energy, but focus the energy. So right now, the cause that I'm most passionate about is awakening change makers, and allowing each person to have their thread based on their own experiences and their own voids and their own gifts and their own hopes, and allowing us to work through the fear of expressing those threads out in the world. And but I will say that I do believe that of all the causes right now, like there is one, and that's climate. And I'm working on a community level. I'm using the energy that I have to support efforts around climate, and to talk about it myself, and to be visible about that, because I think that all the other issues are, like, we need an intersectional approach to the climate emergency. And I think that empowering women is my way of supporting that end goal, because we know when women are in leadership, when women take up space in the social spaces, the outcomes are better for everyone. So yeah, I really feel drawn right now to focus my efforts and advocacy and activism around climate change and women's empowerment.
Mm-hmm. What would you say to the change makers who are listening to this, who feel called to give back, and they often just get totally halted by the grief of it all and the overwhelming just like, this is so much. Like, you know, that we've been watching the rainforest burning and
Yes.
hurricanes and all the things that are happening at this time. And yeah, and oppression and just so much that is going on. It can feel really heavy and to not even know how to move forward. What would you say to those people?
I'd say a few things. Firstly, the grief is so normal and important. And as space holders, as sacred social leaders, really holding space and compassion for the full disaster to be really felt and processed is really important, because until we feel that, if you liken it back to my own journey of hitting burnout, until as a collective we've processed what's happening and why it's happening, it's like we're going to have a partial response to it that hasn't fully, that's still a bypassing response, right? Like, it's still coming from a place of I don't want to feel it, as opposed to, I felt it. It's really painful. And through that, you know, the creative essence has been restored, right? There's a response, there's a visceral feedback once we've fully allowed the feeling to be felt and the catharsis to happen through crying. But what I will say about the grief is that it needs to be held collectively. And so I really feel as though we're on the cusp of not just regenerating the world in terms of, you know, our ecosystem, our biosphere, but that we're also, that's my children, it's in the background there, we're also regenerating culture. You know, we're changing culture. And the biggest culture change that needs to happen is that we need to come back into community with each other. We need to be in circle together, and we need to hold this grief and talk about it together. And only in doing that will we be able to feel like that creative energy is allowed to flow again, but we also feel that we're not alone and that we're not isolated, because that's the lie of capitalism, right? And consumerism, that we're alone, we're isolated, we're individuals. And to counter that culture, to restore some equity in the resource and power balance, it's only going to come from coming together. And I feel like circle is such a profound tool that we're going to see increasingly out there in the world, in the social change space, which really, really excites me. So the first thing I'd say was feel it together. And the second thing I'll say is that I read this beautiful quote from Jennifer Armburst, who runs Feminist Business School, and she talks about that right now, our generation being the ones who have done the wellness kind of spirituality work and have the self-awareness and self-transcendence in mind, that we're the bridging people, right? And so we're building a bridge from the old world to the new. And to build that bridge, there needs to be some crumbling of the old. And so I would say that to really refine the inputs coming in, to focus on both that area of influence that relates to your own experience and gifts. And in a school, we take people through a process to do their vision, but really coming back to that patch that we want to work in, that we want to influence in, that we want to experience the world to be like, and filtering our inputs accordingly, because the number of inputs that we're receiving in the negative are really paralyzing us. So shifting the number of inputs that we're actually seeing and feeling and hearing, but also bringing in the positive inputs. It's really important for our creative energy to have white space, to have time to think, but also to have inputs which are prompting us to be in this creative, innovative, problem-solving kind of space, as opposed to this space of like paralysis and guilt and shame. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you speak more on the void, and like the void being that medicine of an empty space of being able to process and create something from?
Yeah. I mean, the void is, there's so many analogies with it, right? The void is the fertile void of winter. So it's the time when we're processing and feeling the grief and feeling the shame and, worrying about our waste or whatever it is. That void is really fertile. And so allowing ourselves to be in that void in terms of the societal issues is really important, so long as we're actually allowing ourselves to process it rather than bypass it. But on an individual level, I talk a lot about the voids that we've experienced in our life really being fundamental to the world that we want to create. So the voids that I've experienced in my life have been around community, have been around feeling unconditionally loved, have been around feeling vital. So a big void around having a human body and the limitations that come with being a human, and the void of wanting to make a difference. So being able to have a safe place to acknowledge, and like the work that you're doing with your clients and the work that we're all doing as individuals with our clients around that self-empowerment. So how can I meet my own voids in my life, alchemize them, empower myself through them? And as we do that, people start to just naturally say, hey, I noticed you are looking really confident. What happened? Or, you start to create an energy that shifts, that people notice. And so then naturally the next step is when you start sharing, your work, you start sharing your learnings, your wisdom that you've embodied. And so I really feel as though our sacred social visions are intimately related to the voids that we've experienced and then how we've met them. So to take mine one step further, to just see the practicalities of that, my big vision is a world where women take up space in the social spaces and where women feel vital, connected, and loved. And so my vision is actually an energy of itself, right? Like it has its own essence, its own energy that I am the messenger for. And it lives outside of me, but it's connected to me. And I'm the holder of that vision. So I'm the holder of that energy of love, of connection, of change making. And I'm bringing that out into the world. Like I am sharing that. But I can only share it, and I can only hold that vision out of myself and expand it out, express it out to the level that I've worked with that wound in myself. And so you'll see it a lot with visibility, right? That we want to say something, but we can't express it because we haven't yet fully met that void, felt that void, alchemize that void. And so the work really does start within. And like I said, the natural evolution will be this vision, this bigger vision that encompasses your work, your parenting, your relationships, your lifestyle. Like we're regenerating an acre of land here. It encompasses everything. And so you feel purposeful all day, not just when you're at work. You've got a bigger purpose that is moving through you, that is guiding you. And I really feel like it's crazy as a society that we go to work where a vision and mission has been set for us and we don't have one for our lives. We don't have one that encompasses all the parts of us and all the ways that we're expressing and showing up in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does, yeah. Yeah. And why do you feel that so many of us are scared to step into leadership spaces?
Well, I'm sure you would also have a lot of to say on that, because you would see it as well. Partly it's the disempowerment from that word. My main program is called Lead Her, and there's a lot of fear around even doing a program with that word in it, because that word has been appropriated. And I feel like part of our bridging and our culture changing is really about starting to shake that idea that leaders are a certain way, because we've tried that leadership model and it's not working. So we need to redefine it. We need to reclaim it. We need to make it our own, that has a really strong feminine essence within it. I feel like that's just on the semantics, but on the deeper level, it's really the wound of patriarchy. You know, it's the wound of that we're not powerful, that we've been removed from all the ways, or there's been an intervention put between all the ways that we've traditionally expressed power, through our menstrual cycle, through birth, through gathering together, through being rhythmic, being in nature. If you think about our world as it's been built now, every single one of those avenues has been, we've been separated from. And so it's a really natural fear, and there's absolutely no shame in it. And it's really something that is operating on the individual as well as the collective consciousness. And if that is a void that we feel, how that we want to shift, like how can we individually and collectively meet it, understand it, and write a new empowering story. I really feel like if you look at a lot of the literature, you know, books like Pleasure Activism and a lot of the slow living movement and the embodiment movements, they're all pathways to reclaim our essence and reclaim our expansiveness and reclaim parts of ourselves that capitalism and patriarchy have removed. And so if the journey is calling you to connect with like an embodiment practice, or to move into a slow living lifestyle, or to tree change, or to do any of those things, they are acts of revolution. They are acts of rebellion. To be in our bodies, to be slow, to be in nature, that is changing culture, and that is empowering us as women. We're not going to see the effects of that necessarily, but we have to trust. This is part of sacred social leadership. We have to trust that it's causing an effect far beyond what our rational minds can comprehend. And I really believe that.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Yeah. And I think also part of the fear of stepping into leadership can be the vulnerability of attack, like maybe even between women, and like healing those relationships too. The sister wounds, the wounds of, oh, you know, if I shine too bright, I'm going to hurt someone, or someone will be jealous, or someone will, you know, call me out or try to tear me down, or just like that can be a really big fear I see as well. So yeah, with that feminine essence, yeah, I just felt called to share. Another thing that came to my mind is the you know, what you spoke to, the community, the doing it together, the healing, doing that inner work, and also healing those wounds in sisterhood.
Yeah, I love that you reiterated it, because I really think gathering is going to change the world. I'm a crazy optimist, but I do. it's a time of coming back together now, and yeah, it's really powerful and revolutionary in itself as well. I think just to speak to it as well, it feels important to say that as parents and as mothers, that feels like a big reason we can't be leaders. And part of the work that I'm really passionate about doing through my own congruence as much as anything is demonstrating that we don't need to be confined to the busy work in the home. And it's not to say that if that's a desire, we can't have that. Like, I spend a lot of time in my home with my kids, and I'm also a leader. And I feel like the isolation and the aloneness that I think particularly in our culture, in Australia at least, new mothers and mothers are expected to live through is like really dangerous. And actually, if I think about a group of women that have a passion and a fierceness and an energy that the world really needs right now, it's socially conscious, or mothers that are conscious, right? I think that it's so important to start to bring this work, and even as entrepreneurs as well, this work, this alone work, we start to bring it out and be like, I'm doing this, like, see this is important. I'm doing this is taking up space. And so with my kids, I never apologize for having them on retreat or interrupting a call, or because I don't separate myself like that anymore, because it's all part of me. And I think that as women, that compartmentalization it keeps us separate from leadership as well, because we can't possibly see how to take on another role in addition to all of our other roles. Mm-hmm. And so my invitation is, how can we see leadership as a thread flowing between all of these different creative energies that we're stoking in the world, mm-hmm. as opposed to this other thing, this other role that I have to embody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for speaking to the mothers. Mm. Yeah. So I'm curious just what's coming up in your business, in your life. What are you excited about?
I'm super excited about, just on that note, on parenting. So I'm running an immersion. It's just turned spring here. But we're in that transition season, fall over there. And I'm running an 8-week immersion for socially conscious parents, mothers, who want to find more purpose and pleasure and presence. And we're actually going to be, it's not a parenting course, it's a self-empowerment course. And we're going to be kind of exploring some of those myths about social change and about parenting, and how we need to burn out and be alone, and just challenging some of those. So it's really amazing guest mentors, and they're just podcast audios, so they're really accessible, as well as a community. So that starts on October 8th. And then next year, I'm also going to have the Lead Her program. Doors are going to open again, and the first cohort of that is just about to finish. And I just can't tell you how exciting that is to see the shifts happening in these women without much effort, because all the things that I try and do is like less guilt, less shame, no more pressure, please, no more pressure. So how can we really activate energies and changes on an embodied level through the content? That's what I really try and do in the school, so that the shifts are happening without like effort. Because I think, as I said, anything we can do to get away from the idea that we need to be exerting effort all the time is an act of rebellion in itself. So I'm really excited about that. And that's where I'm focusing my energies right now.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And we'll include the link to your site and where people can find more info in the show notes. And I would love to just hear, are there any closing words that you have, or any like really simple acts that even that we can just bring into our day that might be of support to this path of leadership?
Thank you for that invitation. It's so delightful being in your energy on a podcast, Meredith. I really thank you for holding this space. My invitation just came through really strongly, is to take note of where you're already leading. And by doing that, just notice the shifts that you are allowing others to embody in your work, in your home, particularly in relationships, because relational healing is really how social change is transferred, right? Like, it's through relationships. It starts within our immediate sphere of influence. And yet we have this idea that, like, we have to go speak to 10,000 people, but we can't even have a difficult conversation with our neighbor or within our family. So it really starts quite close in. So I just really encourage to get the brain starting to scan for how you're already leading in this area, how you're already influencing others through your actions, through your words, through your beingness, through your not taking action, and just start to find those threads of what people see you leading in. And it really starts to activate the part of the mind that, or the part of the psyche or the subconscious, I guess, that feels like a leader. We start to be like, oh, maybe leadership isn't just speaking to 10,000 people on stage. Maybe leadership is these quiet acts, that are replicated and repeated over a lifetime, and that creates a legacy and an energy. So that's my invitation.
Yes. Yes. And the world that we're living in, all of us have the ability to influence others. What you spoke to before of just the energetics, but also most people in the world have a Facebook profile these days. And, we can have this amazing technology and tool to share the things that we are passionate about, or that we do feel called to speak to. And
and I feel like you speak to that a lot so beautifully around, being an introverted leader. And I think that's part of this process, is finding a leadership expression that is really unique and that feels good for us. Because we have enough people speaking in microphones. Like, we have enough people doing that. We have so fewer people actually being congruent and building a life that really is values aligned. And I think that challenge is when replicated over a lot of individuals, that's powerful.
Yes.
So,
Thank you. Yes, I'd love to just invite us to reconnect with our breath, and just like coming into the embodiment of our heart space, and just letting all of the words and everything that's been shared today to resonate in our cells and our body, asking ourselves, where am I already a leader? How can I give myself even more ownership of that, or recognition and just acknowledgement of all that we are already doing? And to maybe just plant a seed of just anywhere we want to be in even more alignment, or in our embodiment, in our day, in our motherhood, in our friendships, in our all the different ways that we can be in relationship in the world. So just feeling into that. I'll bring my hands to my heart, and with much gratitude to you, Meg, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today. And to everyone listening, thank you for showing up and being present and doing your part. We bow. Namaste. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to our show today. We would love to hear what you think. Take a moment to hop on over to iTunes and leave us a review. We'd be so grateful to receive it. Until next time, namaste.